Oh, forgot my clicker. Let me go over and get it. Thank you guys for having me tonight. Appreciate the invitation. Casey, thank you. Always enjoy getting to come out here. I don't know what kinds of things you did during your quarantine. Maybe you planted a garden. Maybe you used the time to get in shape or clean the house out. Our family decided during the quarantine that we were going to put together a puzzle. And I found something out during the quarantine, that I am really bad at putting puzzles together. And so what we would do is we'd get this puzzle out, we put it on our table, and it was like a 1,000-piece puzzle. And we got the edges, we got the outside pretty quickly, but it was like impossible. And so we got so frustrated with it after a while that we ended up putting this puzzle out into the garage. Well, our kids kept wanting to, we have 3 kids, and they kept wanting to put the puzzle together. And I just didn't really want to do it. And so I kept putting it off, like, we'll do it later, we'll get to the puzzle later. And one night, didn't know where the younger 2 kids were, and it got really quiet. So I'm like, where are they? And so I'm looking around the house for them and find out they're in the garage. And they're at the table in the garage trying to work on the puzzle. But what was kind of disappointing or funny about it was they were trying to put the puzzle together and they didn't have the box. And so they're just sitting around this table trying to put the pieces, but they have no guide as to what this is supposed to look like. Have you ever tried to put a large puzzle together without a box? It's impossible. You can maybe get the edges on your own. Maybe you can kind of match colors up and put some parts together. But without the box, without the full picture, it's pretty impossible to know what you're doing. When you have a few pieces but no big picture, it can be easy to give up. And if I had been with them, I think that's what I would have probably done. The big picture, having the box, that is your guide to the whole process. It shows you where you're going. It assures you that everything interlocks in a way that makes sense. And so when you can't see the big picture, it is frustrating. You may even want to give up. I think right now we find ourselves in a time where it can maybe be a little difficult to see what the big picture is. We can get so distracted by everything going on around us that we can get really frustrated when we don't know what the end result's going to be. Well, the Bible has tons of passages that offer words of hope and encouragement. But one in particular that I want to look at for just a minute, I find especially effective at challenging us to not grow weary or give up. And so it's from Hebrews chapter 12, and it says this, verse 1 through 3. It says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." And I love this idea because I don't know about you, but there have been times, especially over the past 5 or 6 months, where I've gotten a little weary. There's been some times where I felt like I might lose heart. And so I like the encouragement given to people that maybe find themselves in a position where they could potentially grow weary and lose heart. And looking at this idea of a witness, if we define witnesses as those who see, we could be looking at this really powerful, inspiring idea here in Hebrews chapter 12. That there's this applause, this encouragement from history's greatest heroes at the very time that we feel the loneliest and most overwhelmed. That we get this picture, this image of shouts of encouragement from great heroes of faith like Jacob and Joseph and Moses and David. And this passage is actually this really cool mental picture. This thinking of the many followers of Jesus who've gone before us, knowing they know how you feel. Knowing that they know that we have to overcome, and they've overcome and won the trophy. I think about people like my grandmother. I'll be honest, had a kind of a semi-emotional moment driving over here. My grandmother has been sick and found out that she passed away just a couple hours ago. And when I think of people who are heroes of faith in my life, I think of my grandmother. She's 97 years old. There was no unspoken things, like everything that my dad, everything that we wanted to say, we had that opportunity. We had a really cool moment Sunday where only one person was allowed in the hospital, and so we had this big family Zoom session where she could kind of see us on the Zoom meeting. But when I think of people who throughout my life have cheered me on and I know are always praying for me, I think about people like my grandmother. And to have this idea, this picture of people encouraging us to not grow weary and to lose faith and to lose hope, we have this group of believers who are cheering us on. And so we get this cool mental picture. And if you ever go back and read Hebrews 11, if we reread and reflect on those heroes and think about how they've persevered, what gave them the power to overcome and endure? Well, in the moments of life where we feel exhausted and are struggling to keep going, it makes a difference to hear these voices from Scripture, to have this cloud of witnesses who are alive and encouraging us. So when I was at high school, went to this pretty large high school, and I didn't really play many sports in high school, but I did run cross country, and it was the worst 2 days of my life. Really, it was just one day because I went with some friends and we ran like 8 miles, and the next day I was like, hey, I think I'm going to quit the cross country team. And the coach was like, it's okay, you were never on it. But I don't know if you guys realize this. There is a lot of running involved in cross country. I don't think I was fully aware. And one of the things that I found out in that basically one day of cross country was how difficult running can be. And so I didn't really do much running since that time. But a few years ago, probably 10 years ago, at the church that I was working at in Memphis, there was a student at our church that had cancer. And in Memphis, there's this really famous hospital, St. Jude Hospital. They have this marathon, a half marathon that they do every year, the St. Jude Marathon. And so there's a group of us from our church that decided, hey, in order to support this family and this young person, let's get a group together and let's run a half marathon. And as one of the youth ministers there, felt like I kind of had to do it. And I wanted to do it. And so there was a group of about 75 of us that ended up running this half marathon. And I'll be honest, I did not train for this at all. And so going into it, half marathon's like 13 miles. Going to the day of the race, we're all got our matching shirts on. I'm kind of freaking out a little bit. Am I going to be able to walk the next day? I'm not sure. And so the race starts. And I'll be honest, it was surprising to me how easy at some points it was to run during this race. And in the little amount of time that I'd trained beforehand, it was just me running. And I would get really tired really quickly, and I'd want to give up really quickly. But at this half marathon, throughout the 13 miles, there would be people along your journey that were holding up signs and in costumes and cheering you on. And when you're running by people that are cheering you on, it is hard to give up. Like, you want to keep going. And there's one part in particular of this race that is a special part. So at one point during the St. Jude Marathon, you actually run through the hospital. And so at this particular point in the race, you're running through the hospital, and they have some of their St. Jude patients that are out there cheering you on. And they're cheering you as you run, and you want to talk about motivating. I don't think I'd ever run faster than that point of the race, because here you've got these people who are encouraging you to keep going. And they also are having to keep going. Here's this group of people that are not giving up, encouraging you to not give up. And so how can you give up in a moment like this? I think part of what happens in our Christian lives is we have this cloud of witnesses. We have people that have gone on before us and people that are with us now that are encouraging us to not give up, even in moments when we're growing weary and losing heart. When you realize that you aren't alone, when you realize that there is this community cheering you on. Part of being part of the people of God is this group of believers that's encouraging us to not give up. And what it does is it helps us realize that we're actually able to do more than we realized when we're with other people, when we're unified with a group of believers. In Acts chapter 5, if you flip there for just a moment, we get this really cool picture of the people of God. And some of the followers of Jesus had been arrested, and they defiantly are telling the Jewish leaders that they're not going to quit talking about Jesus having risen from the dead. And so in verse 33, when the religious leaders hear this, it says they were furious. They wanted to put them to death. This is in Acts chapter 5, verse 33. Verse 34, but a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, who was honored by all the people, stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered that the men be put outside for a little while. And then he says this to the people that are there. He says, men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed, all his followers were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and all of his followers were scattered. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it's from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God. And then his speech persuaded them. They call the apostles in. They have them flogged. They tell them again not to speak about it. And the disciples leave the Sanhedrin. And they recognize that, man, this was actually something special that happened. They were worthy enough to suffer for the cause of Christ. But to me, there's something significant that happens in this passage here. Gamaliel points something out to the other men of Israel. He'd been around for a long time. He was well respected in the Sanhedrin. And he tells the people there, he says, listen, we've seen this before. There's been others that had come along before Jesus who had claimed to be the Messiah. And they too had had followers come along and say, this is the Messiah. But then they were killed. And after they died, the followers dispersed. But what Gamaliel is pointing out to them is that, listen, there's something different about this group of followers. Instead of them dispersing after he's been killed, they're actually more bold than they'd ever been before. And so he's saying, we might actually be going against God. And what Gamaliel recognized is there was something special about this group of believers. There was something different about them. And here's something that we need to recognize. There is something very different about the followers of Jesus. You can see it. You notice it. You can tell that this community has different priorities. It takes different risks. It's made up of different types of people. And to me, it's incredible that God has chosen to spread the movement and the message of the gospel through the church, through his followers. Jesus starts this movement that turns the world upside down, and he begins it with a core group of uneducated, unimpressive people. And then it gains steam beyond its beginning point. Jesus is crucified and raised from the dead. He appears to hundreds of people over the course of 40 days. They talk together, they eat together. He challenges them to tell people the good news about his deity and the rescue that's offered to others. And when that happens, the movement explodes. And all of this happens without Twitter or email or Facebook or cell phones. The good news of Jesus reaches places like Thessalonica in Greece, Antioch in Syria, Ephesus in Asia Minor. It goes to places like Rome and Egypt and India. On and on, the movement continues to grow. And against all odds, Jesus' church thrives. And that movement has continued to spread to us here today in Florida, in Pensacola, here at the Scenic Hills Church of Christ. It's continued to spread to us today as we get together to worship the son of a carpenter who lived halfway across the world 20 centuries ago. It's quite a story, and this is a story that we get to be a part of. And I hope that it's abundantly clear to each of us how much bigger than you this story is. How many characters there are and have been and will be in this incredible community that we get to be a part of. This church that we get to be a part of. And we all have parts to play. And when we do more together than we can do alone. We do more together than we can apart from one another. Now, at a moment like this, it can be really easy to feel kind of alone. It seems like a long time ago since things were normal. I remember the very first Sunday that we had online worship. And for a couple months, we didn't meet together at all. And I remember that first Sunday getting on, I was the first one at Regency that had to preach for the online worship. And I remember giving a definition of social distancing. We don't need a definition for that anymore. We know what social distancing is. And now, even still, I know at Regency, we can't meet together like we did before yet. And it's really frustrating. It's frustrating to me. It's frustrating to a lot of our members. And one of the things that's frustrating about it is that during difficult times, we should be together, right? I think about my grandmother passing away, and my dad. I can't be around my parents yet. I know there's other that are that way as well. Like I can't be with my mom and dad. I can't give my dad a hug in this difficult time that he's going through. In difficult moments, we want to be together. We want to hug each other. We want to be in the same room. We want to share meals together. But our situation causes us to have to be distant from one another. But here's the thing we've also found out about the church over the past few months. The church is not where we are. It's who we are. The church is not a once-a-week activity. The church is our identity. And so what's happening, may it be a reminder that the church is the people. And while we're not able maybe to meet the same way that we did half a year ago, we do know that the church, like it is tonight, the church is still meeting. And God has a plan for His church. God has a plan for us. The church is called to action. The church is needed now more than ever. And we may be in some ways separated more than we were 6 months ago. We're separated physically, but we're united and together behind the mission of living like Jesus and sharing His love. And we have an opportunity to do that together, even as we maybe have to be socially distant from one another. In Acts chapter 4, we see the chapter before where we were at just a minute ago. We see Peter and John confronted, and they're thrown in jail, and they're told to stop talking about Jesus. And so they say, do you think God wants us to obey you rather than Him? We cannot stop telling about everything that we have seen and heard. What's interesting here is Peter is one of the guys saying this. Peter is saying this. Peter was the same guy who not too long before this was asked by a tween girl if he knew who Jesus was. And Peter denied knowing Him 3 times. And just months later, here Peter is, and he's threatened with arrest, possibly worse, and he tells the most powerful religious leaders that he can't help but talk about who Jesus is. And so what's changed for Peter? Well, we see that they had the power of the Spirit for one, but that wasn't all. They also had each other. Peter and John were able to rely on one another's courage. They were able to feed off of one another's bravery. And they were able to use one another's confidence to say and do things they likely wouldn't have been able to do and say alone. And so before Jesus came back to life, all of the disciples scattered, but once they saw Him alive, they started journeying together. In fact, when John and Peter are freed, they go back to the group of believers that had been forming the church, and they told them what had happened. And so what happened next? Well, they prayed together. And they prayed together specifically for courage. And when they were done, it says that they spoke with even more boldness. In the book of Acts, as we see the church and the movement beginning, the new believers knew that the work they had ahead of them wasn't going to be easy. And they also knew that they needed one another. They understood something that is just as true for us today when it comes to following Jesus. So there's a story from a couple years ago about a woman. Her name's Desiree Linden, and she won the Boston Marathon. This is from 2018. And there's a lot of things about this story that make her victory a really special story. She's the first American woman to win the race in over 3 decades. The weather was some of the worst in the race's history. Linden had even considered quitting the race towards the beginning of it. She says, in this article that I was reading, she says, early on I was feeling horrible. She told her friend that she may drop out as they were running. Linden's friend took now if you know the story, it's kind of a famous bathroom break, and Linden slowed down so that they could catch up to the other racers together. And there's a quote in the article that says, when you work together, you never know what's going to happen. Helping her helped me, and I kind of got my legs back from there. So she stops to help her friend, and then she sort of collects herself, and she keeps going on the race, and she actually ends up winning when she had just thought about quitting a little bit earlier. And in this article about this story about Linden winning this race, it talks about how your brain releases endorphins. And when this happens when you help someone out. Endorphins have a morphine-like way of reducing pain. And some of the other qualities that are released, it says it increases motivation and focus, it boosts your mood. And so in this article, it talks about how they had no doubt that this surge of hormones helped Linden turn the race around. And all of this came from her deciding to help somebody out. And in the article, it continued saying, your brain releases these chemicals when you feel a bond with another person. And this bond reminds you that you're not alone in your suffering. It helps you focus on the bigger picture, not just how bad you feel in the moment. Now, their point in this article was about running and racing and how physically it's important to run with somebody else. They can help you get through it. But to me, as I read this article, I thought more about our Christian journey and walk and the importance of having other people alongside of us to help us continue on that journey. When we have this bond with other people, it helps us able to finish the race. See, being part of a community, being a part of the church, it actually makes us braver. Together we are braver. A community can give us courage. If we've learned anything during this pandemic, we've learned that we have a need for relationships. We started school back beginning of last week. I actually teach a couple classes, teach 6th grade, which my son's in. So it's kind of cool. I get to have him in class. But observing students back on campus, and I'll be honest, they're not super great at social distancing. But it was really cool that first couple of days. You could see how much they had needed to be around other kids. My younger two are in elementary school, and just seeing them around other students, you could tell this is something that they had been missing. You could see their need for relationships. We have a need for other people. Nearly everyone is better, nearly everything is better when it's experienced with a group of people, especially a group of people that you like to be around. It's way better than experiencing things alone. Think about it. Going to the movies. I know it's been a long time since we've been able to go to the movies, but people don't go to the movies typically by themselves, or a football game, right? Who knows when we'll get to do that again, right? You don't typically go to a football game or a sporting event by yourself. You text someone, you ask someone to go with you. The feeling of having someone beside you can be one of the best feelings in the world. It's more fun, it's more enjoyable, it's less awkward, and it can make you feel braver. That's why you see with students, with youth group, most guys won't even talk to a girl unless they get a little encouragement and courage from their buddies. And what's ironic is that when it comes to walking with God, we actually tend to do the opposite. We go to events and games with other people, but we tend to think that we're on our own when it comes to one of the areas that matters most in life, our faith. When it comes to following Jesus, we oftentimes hesitate to let others in. We pray alone. We study the Bible alone. We have doubts and questions, but we wonder about them alone. And it's not a bad thing to do these things, but if we only do this, if we only approach our faith alone, it's a problem there. We're not intended to do faith alone. We're intended to share life and share the gospel with others. We know that every other area of life is better with other people beside us. We are so aware of that right now. So why are we doing faith alone? When we approach faith alone, we miss out on God's plan for community. So a community can give us courage, but you also have something important to give to the community. You have something important that you can give to the church. Your gifts, your talents, your abilities. We need each other. The church needs you. You were not the final destination intended when God gave you whatever He gave you. Your resources, your abilities, God didn't give them to you so that you could go into a corner and enjoy them by yourself. No, that's not how gifts work with God. God does things differently. So the name on the tag of the gift is not actually yours. And if you ever wondered why He gave it to you, it's because He wanted to give through you. Wonderful things happen when God connects us to a community. When God connects us to a body of believers, we're braver, we can do more with our gifts. And when church is at its best, we see people using their gifts to help each other out. God doesn't just call us to Himself. God doesn't just call us to Himself and then scatter us around isolated from each other. We're not called to be hermits for Jesus. We're not called to a place where no one ever has to interact, although some people, that maybe sounds kind of good. It's not supposed to be just you and God forever. This idea is not an option for the disciples of Jesus. Things are better when we do them together. Have you ever noticed with going into a movie theater, and this happens to me when I think back to being in a movie theater. I'll go and I'll get my seat. I like to get there early, and there could be a whole empty theater, and someone walks in, and where are they going to sit? They're going to sit right next to me. Now, I would feel even more uncomfortable with that right now. But usually what should happen is you leave some space between you and someone else. If you ever go into an elevator and you're in an elevator by yourself, if somebody else comes into the elevator, what do? Kind of move to one side. And if a third person comes in, you kind of split the space up a little bit. There's actually a name for this. And there's this picture that used to describe it. And it's funny, I've used this picture before, and it looks very normal now. But this is called, it's like a math term, and it's called a Voronoi diagram. And this is a park in New York City. And the picture is intended to demonstrate this idea that when there's a large space, people will spread out in that space to give themselves some distance. Now, we look at this picture right now, and we're like, that is really good social distancing. They are doing a good job with that. But a year ago, when I would look at this picture, I was like, man, look how spread out people are from each other. In some ways, it's our nature to do this, where we put space between ourselves and other people. And now, not only is our nature to do that, but in many ways, we're kind of forced to do this, to put space between ourselves and other people. What's interesting is that this tendency to do this, to be alone, I think is getting much stronger. We live in arguably the most individualistic society in all of human history. Thanks to technology, we can choose, in the midst of civilization, we can choose isolation. I don't need you to help harvest my wheat. I don't need you to help me build a house. I don't need you to help fix my car. I've got YouTube. I've got a store. I can order my groceries and have them delivered to my house. I can be entertained by pulling up Netflix. I can be completely alone and have everything that I need. And so for us today in the society that we live in, we've found so many ways to put distance between us. And I know we're supposed to be doing that right now. But there's many ways where this distance that we're putting between ourselves should also help us realize how much we need other people in our lives. That's why following Jesus is so upside down. Jesus says, come follow me. And we might be like, well, which ones? Which one should follow you? And Jesus says, all of you, everyone. And we might say, even them, even those people? And Jesus says, yes. Together? Yes. At the same time? Jesus says, yes. Come follow me. God isn't just calling us to him. God is calling us to each other. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we get this really famous passage about the body of Christ. We get this really cool metaphor that Paul gives. And he says this in verse 18. He says, but in fact, God has arranged the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. And so we get this metaphor for what the church looks like. It's a body where all of these parts are needed and important. In the time that we're living in right now, it could be very easy to think to ourselves, you know what? I don't really feel like the church needs me. I don't feel like there's an important role for me to play. And we continue to distance ourselves. Man, I really feel like I can just get what I need by being at home. I don't even know if I need to be a part of a group of believers. We could find ourselves thinking that. But Paul is reminding the church in Corinth, and I think reminding us as well today, that in fact, God has intentionally placed all of these different parts to be included in the body of Christ. And they are all needed. They're needed, I think, even at a time when we're encouraged to be distant from one another. There's a story I read years ago about this couple who was out walking their Jack Russell Terrier. The dog's name was Charlie, and they were walking their dog out in the mountains. A squirrel walks past, and Charlie breaks free and escapes. And so just like that, the couple realized that Charlie was gone. And so they start going around and asking for help to find their dog. They asked some hikers if they've seen Charlie, but no luck. They stopped at the ranger station, asked if anyone had found Charlie, but they hadn't. They called some friends that lived nearby and asked them if they could pray for them as they're looking for Charlie. They called the local radio station to ask them to announce that Charlie was missing. This was no small matter. And so they were getting really nervous. They were concerned. And throughout the course of the day, the community around this area mobilized. A biker rode through the hills calling Charlie's name. Rangers drove the mountain roads looking for the dog. Members of their friend group actually drove in to help search. And as the sun was setting, it looked like the dog might be gone. And then they got a call. Some campers had found Charlie hiding underneath the car that was parked exactly where they had parked that morning. But what was interesting about this story was an observation that the couple made at the end. The couple described what had happened that day as the most profound experience of community that they'd ever had. To me, I think, what if the church unified the same way around the search for lost people? What if the experience of community that people had happened at church and not in other situations like that, but the place that they found their most profound experience of community was here at church? The church is where people should find the most profound experience of community that they've ever had. It can be. It should be. The truth is, though, that we all have a natural tendency to keep our faith journeys to ourselves. There's an illustration that I do with my Bible class when we start the year off. So at Mobile Christian, I've done this illustration the past few years on the first day of school. And it involves this. Can you tell what this is? Okay, this is a spoon, but it's actually a baby spoon. All right, now I don't have any babies that live in my house any longer. But in this example that I give to our students, I say to the sixth graders or the middle school students, I said, okay, when you have a baby spoon, how do you feed a baby with a baby spoon? And so they give me some different options. They say, well, you just cram it in their mouth. Well, yeah, sometimes maybe you have to do that. Or you do an airplane. And so I demonstrate that. I'm not going to demonstrate it for you, but you do some airplane noises. You do a choo-choo train, right? Sometimes you do a dinosaur. That's what we do sometimes in my house. And you do this to make it entertaining so that the baby will eat their food. And so I asked the middle school students, I say, okay, now let's say that my daughter, she's just 6, but let's say she's not a baby any longer, and she's older, and she's about to go on her first date. So she's 30, right? And she's about to go on her first date, or she's 16 or 18 or whatever. And so she's about to go on her first date, and the guy shows up, and they're about to go on a date. And I always ask the class, I say, where are they going to go on their date? And they almost always say Olive Garden. Apparently for middle school students, Olive Garden is the date night location. They do have amazing breadsticks. So they're at Olive Garden. And let's say that I show up at the restaurant on this date. And I go into the restaurant and I slide into the booth next to my daughter. The pasta comes out or the food comes out. And I pull out a baby spoon. And I start taking her food. And while making airplane noises, start feeding my 16, 18-year-old, 30-year-old daughter with a baby spoon making airplane noises. And all the kids are like, oh no, that would be ridiculous to do that. And so I asked them this question, why would that be ridiculous? And they can always come up with this answer. It would be ridiculous because she's old enough to feed herself, right? At some point we have to get to a point where we're old enough to feed ourselves. And the point that I use in class when I do the baby spoon illustration is to tell the students like, hey, you're not elementary kids anymore. You're old enough to ask important questions and to study on your own. You're old enough to not have to have everything entertaining in order for you to gain that knowledge. But one of the things that I worry, and especially right now, with giving this idea is that, well, you can feed yourself, but that's all you have to do. You just feed yourself. You don't even need anybody else to help you any longer. I think it's a combination of both. Yes, we have to feed ourselves and ask ourselves questions and study on our own, but we absolutely need other people in our lives. It is so essential and important that we have a community of believers that we're connected to and a part of that can help us as we go on this faith journey that we're on. This evening, maybe you're here, and maybe you're struggling in some way. Maybe the loneliness of this pandemic, maybe there's an illness in your family, maybe things at work are not going well, maybe your faith, you're really struggling with your faith right now. Whatever you're struggling with, don't struggle alone. Figuring it out by yourself is not strength. Strength is leaning on the community of believers that God has intentionally and purposefully provided to you so that you can be braver than you ever imagined. It might take some boldness this evening for you to come forward, but know that the church is at its best when we look after the parts of this body and encourage them. And so if you're here tonight, and if you need some boldness, if you need some encouragement, if you need to recognize, hey, I've got this community that I'm a part of that cares about me, and I want to share what's on my heart with them. If I want to give my life to Christ and be a part of this community for the very first time through baptism, we want to give you that opportunity that evening. So if there's anything that you're struggling with, any prayers that we can offer on your behalf, won't you come now as together we stand and sing.